G'day, welcome back. Today we're continuing our study of the chess endings in my chess stats series. Done quite a bit already with chess endings. We've looked at who are the better players, and we did quite a detailed study earlier on the winning chances of different particular pawn endgames. Today I'm moving on to a similar but related topic, which is how many extra pawns do you actually need to win in an endgame? And the way I thought about that is just going through the different possibilities. What I've done today, I mean, obviously, whenever I do a video, there's like 10 other videos, which I could do on the back of it, is taking bare kings and then kings with one piece, both sides having the same piece, and just seeing how the chances for winning depend upon, first of all, how many pawns up you are, and how many pawns in total are on the board. And I think that will give us a pretty good idea of the different winning possibilities when you get into endgame, which obviously help in your own games. You know, if you know that certain endgames are more likely to be won than not. Okay, so that's the background. So let's quickly go over to the capture screen. I'll just sort of outline the style of the analysis which I have been doing. Okay, as you can see, I've just included that little graphic there on the board. Let me move it around so you can see it. Just to remind you of what I did before. So this was just a simple example of king and pawn endgames up to 2 pawns, just showing that he's king and 2 pawns versus king and 2 pawns, 51% win rate, basically 50%, and then how that progressed in a game to king and 2 pawns versus king and pawn, king and 2 pawns versus king, and so on. And I've color coded them. That means 97% win rate. So this actually was a bit of a flavor for I did in the previous video. Go back and watch it if you would like. Good idea of obviously in the king and pawn situation, if you're 2 pawns up in two pawns versus 9, you're most likely to be winning. 2 pawns versus 1, quite likely to win. Pawn versus pawn, quite likely to be drawn, and 1 pawn up, king, pawn versus king, classic sort of end game study, 70% chance of winning. Now, these numbers, go over this again, was from, I'd used Casabase, just actually this is real world, actual examples, actual result, not the theoretical result. Some of the studies I've been using the table base, but I just said, you know, whatever the result of the game was, on average, that probably will give you the right sort of result. So what I thought is I've done the king and pawn one example. Now an add-on where each side has a piece each, and then try and do the same analysis to work out what the winning chances are. So just to sort of go through it quickly, what I've really done here is like, here's an example, just an example. I'm talking about material balance, find all games with that material balance. What's the result? And then I've done king. In this study, I've done king and pawn. I've done 2 pawns versus 1 pawn, 3 pawns versus 2, 4 pawns versus 3. And then I've done the same thing with queens on the board. To that. And then I said, what about a 2-pawn advantage? So I've done the same thing with king, and then you can imagine, and then use queens, and then use rooks, and then use knights, and then use bishops with the same color, and then use bishops with opposite color. And this will give us a good idea of that extra pawn or those extra 2 pawns. What does that mean in terms of your winning chances? Now, I'm just going to, before we get on to it, let's just sort of have a brief sort of concept in our own mind, what we'd be expecting, right? So the more extra pawns the stronger side has, obviously the greater winning chance. The number of pawns on the board in total tends to increase the winning chances as well, because you've got more chance to apply pressure and get an extra pawn, for instance, right? Just seems to offer more winning chances. And the piece is pretty important too. King and pawns versus king and pawns. Pawn advantage is quite instrumental. You can imagine with queens and rooks that there's a lot of drawing chances, actually, mainly because of checks and king safety issues, so on. So basically, you've got to think about what pieces on the board. Pawn structure matters as well. Passed pawns are stronger, perhaps, if they're particularly protected. Isolated pawns, you know, many isolated pawns can be weak, and pawns on both sides of the board or one side of the board. All these factors which kind of come into it. I'm not going to be able to look at all of those today, but maybe in later videos. King position, safety from checks, I mentioned it. And the other thing which is kind of unique to the minor piece endgame, knight and bishop, is that you often have the chance just to sack your piece for the last pawn, for instance, or sack your piece for the second last pawn, and then you can grab the other pawn. So that doesn't work with queen and rook, the major piece endgames, because you sack your rook, or queen, you're in trouble. So this is the sort of factors which are going to sort of explain what happens in a real life situation. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly explain the process I used for doing this analysis. Okay, let me get out of the way. Let's go into, I'll call it just looking. We'll just go into the file. Now, I just want to sort of highlight, this is the sort of thing, you know, if you want to do it yourself, these are the tools that you use. I have used the CASA database, and I'm using Python Chess. These codes are all in Python Chess. And then I use Scoutfish to do the queries on the Acer database, and that comes back with the games. And then once I come back with the games of each material balance, I then work out what the score was, and that's basically how it works, right? I'm not going to run it full time, but if you, for instance, run it, let's just run it like this, and what this will show you is the queries. He's putting these queries into Acer. This is the way Scoutfish works. We're querying for king and pawn, king two pawns with king two pawns. And actually what I do is I put it, it's got to be two ply in a row. We'll get back to that. That was quite interesting in the king and bishop situations, but two ply in a row. So it's not transitional, it's actually position. You could imagine restricting it more, saying, oh, it's got to be in that balance, material balance for 4 moves or something like that, right? And then you'll reduce the number of games which qualify, but you might get a clearer, sort of a finer definition of the outcome of the game in those positions. Okay, so having run that, I've generated the results for, as I said, all these end games with a king or a king and one piece, with 1 and 2 pawn imbalance up to 4 pawns. So I haven't gone to 5 pawns on, just to get a bit of a sense of what it really looks like. I think the best thing to do now is let's just quickly run across and load up my Excel where I have saved these results. Okay, so here's the Excel sheet with the results for each piece type. So this is bare kings, and you can see I've put the percentages in there for this number here is a 1 pawn advantage, 1 pawn versus no pawns. 1 pawn advantage where it's 2 versus 1, 79%, 3 versus 2, 83%, 4 versus 3, 86%. These are plotted over here in this chart, and you can see that if you look at the what's this this line here, 1 pawn advantage, the stronger side will win 70% of the time with just 1 pawn versus 0, but actually that chance increases as you go up. Whereas interesting enough here, when you got the 2 pawn advantages, actually king and 2 versus king and none is actually the one which actually gives you the best chances, because maybe there's some chances to cause some disruption if it's 4 versus 2, right? So that's the bare king. And you go to the queen. We'll look at a summary chart at the end, by the way, but it just gives you a bit of a flavor of the position. So 1 versus 0, 71%. 2 versus 1, 72%. 3 versus 2, 73%. And 4 versus 3, 76%. What you notice here is actually these lines are quite flat. This really gives you a sense that queen can cause a lot of disruption in terms of perpetual checks and so on. So that's a sort of interesting result in itself. Go to the next sheet. There's rooks. Rooks are known as being quite drawish, and we'll see later whether that's true or not. But certainly the 1 pawn advantage, you got about a 70% increasing chance of being able to win with that material balance. 2 pawn advantage is pretty strong when you rooks on the board. And then we have the knights. Let's go to the knights. Same situation. The more pawns you have, the more chances you have for pushing your advantage. Bishops. Now there's 2 types of bishops. Actually, I had a feature into my code which actually said, okay, bishops and opposites, bishops not opposites. So this is bishops of the same color, and just sort of remember the numbers. 2 pawn advantage, almost winning, and 1 pawn advantage goes from 67 to 82%. And if you have a look at bishops opposite colors, well, of course the numbers are lower. It's 53% only. And you think it is 53% 1 pawn versus none, you'd actually expect it to be drawing, right? And actually, I increase that window. It's got to be a streak of like 3 or 4 rather than just 2 half ply, because you can imagine that there can be sort of an exchange towards the end of the game. That got down to 51%. So basically, 1 pawn advantage in bishop opposites worthless. And actually, it's also true for the more pawns you get. It's kind of a lower number. And 2 pawn advantage, it's getting pretty reasonable by then anyway, because 2 pawns kind of helps quite a lot. It's unusual. They may not be able to win it. Obviously, you can do blockades in different positions. So that's the different combination I've done. Actually, here, this sheet here was the one where I increased it to 4 ply, bishops on opposite colors, and you can see that win rate dropped all the way down to 51%, or it's on average you draw. Okay, cool. So that's the individual scores for the individual pieces. And obviously the thing to do here is to put them all on one chart, and then sort of think about what it kind of means in terms of endgame implications. So here we see the 2 charts. Here you can see the 2 charts. Great. So top chart there, winning chances with a 1 pawn advantage. I see there's a spelling mistake there, but never mind. Right, so what can we say about this chart? It seems like if you look at this line here, it looks like the lone king, it's the easiest to force your advantage, except when you've got a 1 pawn advantage. It's probably probably situational. A lot of positions may may come because the weaker side knew it was a draw. The bishops are opposites, as expected. Way lower chance of getting an advantage with just the 1 pawn, even the 2 pawn. Definitely the odd man out in these charts. Bishop and knight both have this. This is the blue one here. That's the knight, and that's the bishop of the same color. When it's 1 pawn, they both have the lowest winning chance because, as I said before, I mentioned a thing about this. That there's the chance of being sacked to get rid of the last pawn. But the point. Then you switch over to the major pieces. The major pieces, although the winning chance for 1 pawn advantage, 1 versus 9 is the highest, these charts are quite flat. And what that means is as you have more pawns on the board, then versus the minor pieces, the major pieces have more chance of having checks and perpetual checks and things like that. So I thought that's kind of a sort of an interesting sort of effect there. And then we can just quickly look at this one, just chart title, and just this is the 2 pawn advantage. Same overall conclusion. Bishops opposites. This one down here is the one hardest to win. King is the one that does best with the 2 pawn advantage. You've got the same sort of impact where the queen and the rook. Remember, the queen, orangey one, and then the rook, the green one. They're kind of quite hard on these ones to win. And bishops are the same color. Look at it there and in the chart above. Bishop of the same color seems to be the one which has the best winning chances. Maybe that's the best sort of endgame to get into if you only got a 1 or a 2 pawn advantage. So with all that being said, let's just close out. I'll just put it here. Let's put a summary of what we learned. Best winning chances, king only. There's kind of one thing to look at. So that's a lesson we learned. You get rid of pieces, you keep pawns on the board. Best drawing chances. Bishops of opposite. I think we know that one. Pretty standard. Next best drawing, queens. Obviously, you can cause a lot of distraction. And if you have a piece on the board, best other piece to win, bishop of the same color. There's minor little refinements in there, but I think that's some sort of lessons to think. Rook and knight seem to be pretty similar in terms of the profile. In terms of the sort of the pattern and so on. So I think that's sort of, I'll close it out there today. I've come up with a bunch of other ideas to work on, sort of extend this analysis, but I hope that sort of helps people understand that when they're sort of exchanging down to endgames, what type of endgames are the best ones to look for. Great. Okay. Hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.